Welcome, everyone. I think it's a good time now to get the ball rolling here. So, thank you all for joining. I'm very, very, very happy to be here with Ryan from High Trust to present you guys very valuable information on building resilient third party risk management programs. All right, so I am Brianna Plush. I am the field manager here at Bar Advisory, and I'm joined alongside Ryan, and I'll turn it over to him to give a brief introduction.
Yeah, thanks for joining, everybody. Ryan Patrick, Vice President of Adoption at High Trust. My role is not as clear as Brianna's. My role is, part-time educator, part-time uh, critic fielder, part-time, working with the market and government in trying to understand the things that High Trust are doing and how we can help other organizations, other entities, other industries achieve the risk mitigation that I think everybody is desperately searching for. So excited for this topic. It's one that I am really passionate about. If you've ever seen me on LinkedIn, I'm talking about TPRM just about every day. So I'm ready. Let's do it.
Let's do it. It's important stuff. All right, just to take you guys through a brief agenda here, what we're going to be covering. We've got the current threat landscape. What is vendor risk management overall? We're going to dive into that vendor risk review process, talk to you a little bit about the tools and frameworks, get into AI, current buzzword, it's everywhere. We got to talk about it and how that weaves into vendor risk management. And then we'll talk a little bit about vendor incident response, and then we'll have some time for Q&A for any questions that pop up during the webinar.
Yeah, so I think it's important to set some context of why we're talking about this. And third party risk is not something that's new. It's been around for decades at this point, but it's becoming more commonplace in the GRC circles, the security circles, the risk management circles, because it's not working really well. And organizations are struggling to not just manage their vendors, but understand, where the risks reside, what to do about it, how to overcome it, how to work collaboratively with their third parties, their supply chain partners, and the like. And what we're seeing now is that third party breaches are increasing year over year. And I think it's probably for a couple different reasons. One being most organizations have a ton of vendors. I mean, tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, depending on the size of the organization. So the attack surface for some organizations is huge. So statistically speaking, they're probably going to realize a breach through one of their third parties than they would organically. But what malicious actors have realized is that because we've been doing this security thing for so long, a lot of organizations are doing a lot of the right things from a control implementation perspective. And it's really, really hard for them to come through the front door, the back door, whatever door for their preferred target. And they're looking for the soft underbelly. And those third parties are the soft underbelly. So they're actually attacking your third parties to get access to your environment because you are actually the target. So this is not going away. Third party risk I mentioned it's been around for decades at this point, but it's typically under resourced, and TPRM teams are overwhelmed. They're exhausted, and the vendors, the supply chain organizations, are exhausted as well because they're having to answer unique questionnaires for every single one of their customers. And they're generally covering the same types of questions, but asked in different ways and in different formats. And it just takes a lot of time and effort to answer those questions. And that's even if they answer them. A lot of times they don't even answer them. And if they do answer them, it's all yes, no. And how helpful is yes, no? So TPRM teams don't have the time, the resources, in some cases, the expertise to be one, chasing vendors to get them to fill it out, two, get them to fill it out with enough specificity where it's meaningful information, and then three, doing some kind of due diligence based on those responses to kind of trust but verify. So there's this like I don't want to say perfect storm. I don't want to be dramatic about it, but there's a lot going into what we're seeing from a third party risk management perspective today that I personally think needs to be addressed. And hence the reason why I'm so passionate about it and talking about it all the time.
Absolutely. All right. Yeah. So what is this vendor risk management? How can we do our best at our organizations to try to close this gap a little bit where we have this exposure with our third parties? So vendor risk management is the process of identifying and mitigating the risks introduced by third party vendors. So, this is going to be inclusive of all the processes and systems involved with managing vendor risk. And this includes selecting the right vendors, conducting that due diligence, onboarding these vendors appropriately, performing ongoing monitoring, and then adequately offboarding them when the time is right or it's necessary. So these risk management programs for our third parties give your organization very useful information into the vendors you're working with, how you're working with them, and whether or not their security standards, their service delivery, their viability is up to snuff based on what your organization deems appropriate, the standard. So these programs are very vital. As Ryan mentioned, third parties are heavily utilized, and reliance on them, especially cloud providers, is becoming ever more apparent with our increasingly remote based workforces and operations. Vendor risk is something pretty much every organization faces, obviously. And so these effective management programs are key to addressing these risks, which Ryan is going to dive into a little bit deeper.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, there's in most cases hundreds, thousands as organizations start to get bigger, tens of thousands when they're absolute behemoths. And as you would imagine, with that sheer scale of interconnections, and I use that term purposely, but also loosely, it may not be a direct integration, but your two organizations have interconnected, they've intersected to a certain degree. So the sheer scope or possibility of risks that are presented kind of spans the spectrum. Everything from obviously cyber risks to compliance and regulatory risk, financial risk, operational risks, strategic risks, legal risk, really everything that you would think about under the umbrella of third party risk management. And what we're seeing is because there's so many different facets of third party risk, it's really hard, on top of what I've already explained is hard, for organizations to wrap their arms around that because you can't ask, you shouldn't ask a 500, 600 question questionnaire to cover all of these things. It's grossly inefficient. You probably don't even have the time or resources to review the answers sufficiently. They don't have the time or resources to answer them sufficiently. So we need to start to kind of hone in on risks that are probably pretty important. Bree mentioned, CSPs. They're some of the most common across the board vendors that most organizations are interacting with. So there's shared responsibility there, right? Because they're managing controls on your behalf, but that doesn't mean they're impervious. I think it's been proven that there are significant vulnerabilities, primarily at the application level, within a cloud environment that's on the organization that's consuming that cloud infrastructure to reinforce. There could be service interruptions. One thing that I've noticed recently is a lot of people focused, if you think about the CIA triad for cybersecurity, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, historically, we've only really focused and paid a lot of attention to the confidentiality of data, especially in heavily regulated industries like finance and healthcare. But with the advent of ransomware, availability of data is becoming paramount. I actually firmly believe that ransomware is fundamentally changing the way that we should be looking at TPRM, because you can't just simply ask the questions, well, how much of my data or how many records is this vendor consuming of mine, or what kind of remote access do they have, you have to start asking questions like, if this vendor goes away, am I able to generate revenue? If the answer is no, whoop, they go way high on the holy moly list, and you need to pay a lot of attention to them. So, just understand that there's a lot of different facets of risk. I personally believe that the cyber risk is the foundation for everything else, because if you have some kind of incident or breach, it likely is going to impact you financially, operationally, from a legal perspective, regulatory. So there's, like, if you think about the pillars that are all those things that I just said, there's a foundation there, and that, to me, that's the cyber side of TPRM.
Awesome. All right, so kind of getting into, we understand that vendors pose all of these risks to our organization depending on how we utilize them. So, how do we go about approaching this risk review process for them? So, we start off with identification. So, we're going to identify these potential vendors. We have a business need that we've decided needs to be fulfilled by a third party organization. So, some of the thought process that goes into this is, what function is this third party going to perform for our organization? Map these potential third parties to the systems and the data they're going to access. Have a very thorough understanding of all the services they are going to provide, because this is going to help you set up a baseline for having an understanding of the different types of risks the vendor might introduce into the organization once they start delivering services to you. So, with that identification piece of it, it kind of feeds right into the initial risk assessment. So, at this point, your organization should have an overall risk management strategy and an overall risk appetite for the organization. So, utilizing that criteria, evaluating these vendor risks based on how you're going to be using this third party is the next step. And you also have to have an understanding of any standards and regulations that apply to the organization that also have unique guidelines in regards to use of third parties. So in this stage, you'll be gathering information from the vendors through those questionnaires, obtaining and inspecting compliance reports, financial reports, any attestation reports. And you want to perform an evaluation of this information to identify any areas of potential gaps in their controls, any vulnerabilities, any weak spots in their overall posture. You're going to want to evaluate overall their reputation, what you believe their ability to provide these services, and things like that. And then we'll get into the tier assignment of these third parties. So, based on your initial risk assessment of what the vendor is going to be performing for your organization and how you've evaluated them, the vendors will be assigned to a certain tier of criticality based on the risk classification. So, this will cue the decision makers and the relationship managers to understand which of those vendors are critical, which are for performing core business functions, which ones we could not operate if they went down. And then the which ones that are lower risk. And that's how they can approach the relationship and ongoing monitoring as appropriate based on the impact of these vendors. In the documentation and due diligence phase of the process, now we're documenting these results of our risk assessment and performing additional due diligence. So we want to probe deeper and supplement and feedback into that risk assessment. So conducting further inquiries about the organization, the third-party organization, how they operate, the areas they operate, taking a deeper look into those compliance reports and having a better understanding of their control gaps, their potential vulnerabilities, and having this all documented. So, we looked at an ISO certification report for this third party. We inspected their business continuity plans. Here's our evaluation of the overall risk, the viability of the relationship, our ultimate decision made, and any risk mitigation plans developed as part of that review should be documented and available to appropriate stakeholders. And after this initial review process, the decision has been made, obviously, but this job is only just the beginning. So now we go into the continuous monitoring and mitigation part of our process. So Monitoring has to be performed over the vendor's performance, their service delivery, their compliance posture, their financial posture, and having an effective initial documentation of that risk review and due diligence and risk mitigation plans allow for a solid foundation and understanding of the decision process. And it allows for benchmarking for future performance to compare and measure their compliance posture and their progress. And it also provides an understanding of, the controls that your organization decided needed to be implemented to mitigate any of the additional risk that was posed by engaging with this vendor, and then continually assess the effectiveness of those controls in mitigating that risk over time. So the mitigation and the ongoing monitoring is a very, very big piece of the whole program, one that can't be overlooked, and often is one that is very, very difficult. The resources are constrained when you're working with so many third parties. It's difficult to do, but these days there's software out there that helps with continuous monitoring to hopefully alleviate some of that pressure from those teams. But it's really such an important piece of the puzzle because you have to be on monitoring them. So if they have a new vulnerability, a new exposure, a breach, you have to be able to identify and react very, very quickly because your operations are now intertwined when you engage with.
Yeah, if I could jump in for a second.
Yep.
It's important to point out that there are stakeholders involved in this entire process, right? One of the things that we didn't highlight on this slide on purpose is the business owners. The people who are actually bringing this vendor into the organization are a critical piece to this entire process. Because if they aren't willing to support your risk-based decisions, right? Because there is the possibility that you do the due diligence, like Brianna just mentioned, and discover this vendor's terrible. Like they don't care about security. They're not doing anything from a security perspective, so on and so forth. And you may go back to the business and say, I don't support bringing this vendor on. And they may overrule you. They may go to their boss or whomever and say, I can't generate revenue if I don't bring this vendor on board. So I share that because there's a step before this process, at least in my mind, my personal opinion, that revolves around the culture of TPRM for the organization. If the business doesn't understand the TPRM team's role, then it's going to be a really painful process, or it's going to be a process that is a waste of time, right? Because if we're just going to onboard every vendor, then why are we doing the due diligence? Why spend the time? Why spend the money doing that type of work? So I encourage all of you, I'm sure most of you, if you're on TPRM teams today, already know what the heck I'm saying, but I encourage all of you to, build relationships with the business owners. Find common ground. Build some kind of policy that, dictates risk decisions and how they're made based on the organization's risk tolerance and risk appetite. Because this process will get undermined really, really quickly if you're not doing that step zero, so to speak. All right. So Bree mentioned tiering vendors, and I've already kind of alluded to this, so I'm going to repeat myself to a certain extent. But because of the sheer number of vendors, there has to be some kind of triage. And there may be risk priorities determined on which vendors you're going to spend arguably the most time with. Ideally, if you have the time, the resources, you are looking at all of your vendors, even the ones that are deemed not critical or low risk. But that's not the case in a lot of organizations. So you may only focus on your first two tiers, the high and critical risk vendors. You still want to do something for the lower risk vendors, but I want to kind of foot stomp what I said on the previous slide is don't get solely focused on the confidentiality of data or even the integrity of the data. If you have a service provider, a vendor, or whatever you want to refer to them as, that is providing a critical service, and a very simple question to ask is, can I survive without this vendor? If the answer is no, then that should automatically escalate them up. And you should probably not just do the due diligence, but really focus on what Brianna was talking about around ongoing monitoring and build a collaborative relationship with them and do things like tabletop exercises and understand whose roles are what, where, when, and how if there is an issue or an incident. You may also have to look at contingency vendors. Hopefully, this is not a vendor that is the only one in the marketplace that can do it. You may have to have some secondary contracts in place. So if your primary vendor goes down, you can step this up. And the reason, and the classic use case right now, at least recently, is the Change Healthcare issue that happened. It crippled the United States healthcare system. And people didn't realize the sheer span that Change had within the healthcare industry. And it wasn't, it was indirectly a confidentiality issue, but it was an availability issue. Small clinics, 1 and 2 doc practices could not generate revenue because they could not process claims. So they were in jeopardy of going out of business. They could not pay their employees. So it's those types of things that I really want to encourage you all on. When you're doing your risk tiering, is think about the business side of TPRM and how the decisions that you make or the way that you focus your attention will enable the business to stay operational and be able to generate revenue. Super critical. All right. So what do we do about it? Well, being my biased HITRUST guy hat on, I'm going to say leverage HITRUST, right? There's lots of good reasons to leverage HITRUST, which I won't necessarily get super bogged down on that. But there are standards, regulations, frameworks that can be useful in this context. I obviously have an extreme bias towards HITRUST. It dates before I even became a HITRUST employee. But I do have a huge disdain for questionnaires. I don't think we need to we should get rid of questionnaires fully, right? Because there's relational questions that need to be asked and understood. But from a security controls perspective, don't use questionnaires. Leverage certifications, attestations, the things that you're seeing on the screen to do the due diligence, because arguably, and I'll give you the HITRUST numbers just because it's the ones I'm most familiar with. Like if you have a questionnaire and let's say it's 300 questions or 200 questions, you have to take that. In all my conversations with TPRM leaders, I ask, how many hours, how much time per question are you spending per vendor? And they're like, maybe 15 minutes per question. So only a handful of hours on the full spreadsheet, not including chasing the vendors. Then it completely explodes. When you look at the HITRUST R2, the average number of testing and validation hours, folks like the BAR team who do this type of work, 479 hours are spent on that assessment. On the high side, I've heard people say 40 hours per vendor. When you look at a HITRUST assessment, the amount of work is 10 times what you're doing organically. And I'm sure Brianna can talk to us about ISO and how much time is spent doing an ISO assessment and ultimately certification. So I encourage you, I'm not saying take an ISO or HITRUST carte blanche without doing some kind of due diligence, but leverage that work to gain efficiencies and focus on the things that matter to your organization from a control perspective. And my cliche example always is multi-factor, right? So let's say someone hands you an ISO cert or a HITRUST cert. Don't have them fill out a 300 question questionnaire that's arguably going to ask the same questions that they already were tested, validated, and certified against. But read that report. Feel free to do sample due diligence based on that report and ask, hey, can you show me how your MFA is configured? Because I'd really like to understand if it's configured for just privileged access users, or is it for standard users? Is it on all applications? How is this configured? And focus on those types of things, the things that are actually going to prevent breaches based on the threat intelligence today, as opposed to just going through this process of filling out questionnaires. I personally am not a huge fan of relying on HIPAA or SOC 2 for a number of reasons. I won't get bogged down on that, but just understand what tools, what frameworks you're willing to leverage, because they're not all created equal. And it may seem like there was good work done here, but because of the variability and the way that the assessments are conducted and the way the reports are written, it may actually cause you more work than if you went with a more standardized approach. So I'm going to pause there. I'm curious if Brianna has any thoughts or comments.
Oh yeah, I could echo everything you just said. Specifically, yeah, I mean, I love as an auditor, performing these HITRUST assessments for my clients when they say, "Oh, one of our customers wants us to get certified through HITRUST, like to this level and everything." And I love hearing that because I love just knowing that there are people out there who have an understanding of what they require of the people that they're working with. So to what you said, Ryan, it's really important for, your business to understand the level of compliance that you're willing to accept. I don't want to just rely on a SOC 2 report, which can be slightly arbitrary sometimes. I want, a HITRUST I1 or R2, or I want an ISO 27001 certification to look at, because that's really important. And it is so much better than these questionnaires. Questionnaires can be good if you need to learn more about the actual third party, but it doesn't say much in terms of their actual security or their compliance for a lot of reasons. And these auditors, they're spending so much more time assessing these organizations. As someone who does it, I read the terms of service for their third parties. Everybody always skips over those. I read them for my job. I'm reading these contracts. So I know a lot about their third parties, my clients' third parties, possibly sometimes more than they do. But that just kind of shows the level of detail and how thorough these auditors get in these assessments, and how much more valuable they are in the decision-making process for, vendor risk, relying on these reports. These frameworks were developed in order to help these teams make better decisions. And so that's why I'm with you, Ryan. Definitely utilize them. They are the creme de la creme to rely on when making these decisions, for sure.
Sweet. So I didn't say anything wrong.
Not at all. Awesome. All right. So was it Mariana in the chat? She asked a great question, and I'm going to get into it a little bit now in this slide. AI-powered third parties. And in this day and age, I think that we'd be hard-pressed to find many organizations that don't utilize AI to some extent at this point. So obviously, there's a lot of good that comes with the use of artificial intelligence, but a plethora of potential risks and unknowns. So how do we prep ourselves to effectively manage risks related to these AI-powered vendors? Naturally, we need to be tailoring those risk assessments to include AI-specific considerations and questions. So we need to have an understanding that not all AI tools pose the same risk. So when we're classifying our vendors, we obviously need to take into account how they are utilizing AI at their company, and then how that's going to be impacting the services they provide for us and our operations. So it's good to have an understanding of your third parties, their data sourcing when training their AI model. What data are you using? How is it sourced? How is the model monitored for bias? Can you explain the decision logic? Is your output auditable? Is there human accountability in your AI outputs? And what does your governance structure look like? So these are all considerations that really need to be thought through when dealing with an AI powered third party. And it can seem a bit daunting because it is, but luckily, there are AI specific frameworks. You'll see them on the slide to provide some guardrails and a level of assurance needed for that comfort over our AI powered vendors. So I'm going to touch on them a little bit here. I'm going to go a little out of order, starting with the ISO 42001. So the ISO 42001 is the purpose is to provide guidance for establishing, implementing, maintaining, and then continually approving an AI management system within the context of the organization. So this is really going to be focusing on the management of AI at the organization. Then we've got the NIST AI RMF. This is a voluntary self-assessment that organizations can conduct, and this will tier them based on their maturity and sophistication of their AI management practices. And then finally, again, I'm a little biased, but HITRUST AI assessment options. And again, I won't bog down on them too much, but having dealt with them, I obviously know a lot more. I've seen them in practice. But HITRUST offers the AI security assessment, which is a formal assessment resulting in a certification. They've got AI control selections that are tailored for the different deployment scenarios based on the organization's inherent risk. And then they've also got the AI risk management assessment, which is a self-assessment, kind of similar to NIST, that helps you identify gaps and vulnerabilities in your current AI control coverage. And then it gives you an insights report that kind of tells you, where you need to work on it. But the point being here is that those frameworks that we're talking about, they have done the work to think through, what needs to be considered when we're utilizing AI in our operations. And so we really should be relying on this because this is another instance where, somebody else has done the work for you, and this can really assist in the decision-making process. So it's important to be asking your vendors, do you have any of these AI assessments? Can we review the results and things like that? Because it really provides great valuable information into how they're utilizing and managing their AI. And that can really seem pretty murky when you're engaging with a third party. There's a lot to be considered when it comes to AI. So these are really great prescriptive frameworks that help us assess the security and management of AI.
Yeah, just a couple things to add. If you look at the NIST AI RMF, if you look at 42001, they're more high level, right? The NIST AI RMF is looking at risk management of AI. ISO 42001 is looking at all facets of responsible AI when it comes to AI management systems. Neither one of those two actually are digging into hard-nosed AI security threats and the controls that should be in place to address those. That's where HITRUST comes in, right? Not to supplant either one of those, but to augment those for your AI-powered vendors in what they're doing to protect the models. So it's important to understand the nuances between all of these different standards because they don't all do the same thing. They're focused on different things. So, Mariana, when you talk about what due diligence measures need to be put in place, you have to ask yourself, well, what's important to me? Am I comfortable just managing risk? Or do I want to know that they've actually implemented and scaled these AI security controls in order to protect the model and ultimately protect the product or service that you're using? So there's some education that probably needs to happen in order to determine what's the most appropriate course. As a biased HITRUST guy and security guy, I'm automatically going to gravitate towards the HITRUST AI security assessment and certification. But there are use cases where it's not appropriate. The other thing that I would offer is I get asked a lot. I realize that I have hundreds of vendors that are using AI in some way, shape, or form within the product or services that they're providing to me. It's so daunting because I'm now having to play catch up. I don't know where to get started. And what my advice to folks has always been is don't overthink this. AI security in the TPRM context is very similar to traditional security within the TPRM context. So leverage your existing policies, processes, the way the program operates today, where you're evaluating traditional security risk, and just layer in the AI stuff. Obviously, how you tackle new vendors will be different than how you go back retroactively to current vendors and assess those risks. But just take little bites at a time. You don't have to, cast this wide net immediately and try to ascertain the risks of all of your AI vendors at once. Just make a deliberate plan. Don't overthink it, and just work on it over time, and you'll see that the progress is made. So I just wanted to throw those out there because I find that people are really intimidated by AI risk right now because they're typically not super familiar with how AI works and the threats and the controls and how it all interconnects. Just trust what you already know about traditional security and just apply those principles to the AI side of the house. All right, I want to jump into vendor incident response plan. There's this adage in the security community, the GRC community, that says it's not a matter of if there's going to be a breach, but a matter of when. I actually hate that saying because it emits defeat in my mind, but to a certain extent, it's reality. And as a former military guy, like I'm all about training for contingencies. So understanding what the plan is for your critical vendors, especially the ones I told you about, like, hey, if this vendor goes offline or becomes unavailable, like what the heck am I going to do because I can't operate as a business? Like you need to have detailed plans. You need to have a relationship with that vendor where they understand their role in your world in order to overcome that and have resiliency built in, right? Don't get solely stuck on the confidentiality and the integrity of data or the services. That availability piece, and I have a tendency to repeat myself when I feel passionately about something, is uber critical. Look at the availability piece. There's lots of resources, tools that you can use, like tabletop exercises, to understand what the plan is. Because I just did a podcast recently with a woman who wrote a book on the culture of cybersecurity, and she talked about resiliency being really important in the culture. If you think about when an incident happens, the bang, there's the actions to the right of the bang, what happens afterwards, and there's actions that happen to the left of the bang, what happens before. You have to work both sides of those because when the bang happens, there's going to be people that are unavailable. They may be on PTO. They may be personally impacted and they are not able to cope with what's going on with them personally as well as professionally. So building those plans in, having folks that understand the roles and responsibilities of the other groups involved or the other teams involved becomes really, really critical. I admittedly will say that you probably can't spend this much time, what I'm suggesting, on every single one of your vendors. This is where that risk triage and that prioritization really comes into play. And the due diligence is an input into that, right? If Bree is out there and she does an audit and she sees that somebody has no incident response plan, you're probably going to pay attention to them a little bit more, right? So just understand that context.
All right. So, just as Ryan said, everybody always says it, and it is the right mindset you should have. It's not really a matter of if, it's when a breach will occur. So, we've talked about, how to perform due diligence in your selection, how to assess your ability to respond to these incidents, but the foundation that this all has to be built on is the trust with your stakeholders before anything is even amiss. So, this is done through establishing clear goals and demonstrating that your company is reliable. You have to signal to them that you're committed to security and privacy and protection of their data. And then you have to show them what you're doing to achieve these commitments and be transparent in your efforts and your operations. And that'll really have you better positioned to mitigate any damage or loss of trust that goes hand in hand when a breach occurs. That's really the backbone that you can rely on when anything like this happens, is that foundation of trust that you have to build with your stakeholders ahead of all of this. All right. So what? So how can we take this a little bit further? How can we think through our own vendor risk management programs and take what Ryan and I were talking about and bring it back to our organization? So some things to think through, discuss with your team members, how can we better align our vendor risk management practices with our overall risk management strategy? How do we define and measure success within our VRM program? Is our incident response plan adequately equipped to respond to incidents involving our third parties? Are you measuring your vendors by their resiliency instead of data protection? And how often are you updating your questionnaire based on new threats and attack vendors?
So I want to jump in on that last one.
Mhm.
It might seem like it's a little out of left field, especially considering that I've said that I think questionnaires need to go away to a certain extent. But I realize that they're not going to go away in the near term. I feel pretty passionately about moving from compliance to security, and that's done through understanding what the threat landscape is. If you, and I say you generally, are not thinking about today's threats and attack vectors and focusing on those, then you're likely going through a compliance exercise that may not reap a whole lot for you based on from a risk mitigation perspective. At HITRUST, we're consuming threat intelligence on a monthly basis, looking at those threats, and on a quarterly basis, we do analysis to understand whether our controls are protecting against the threats that are happening today, right? When you look at, and I don't mean to pick on ISO 27001, but the most recent version is 2022, right? The version before that was 2013. So there was a 9-year difference between the two standards. Think about how the technology world and the landscape, the threat landscape, have changed in 9 years. So we're committed to making sure that our control selection for our assessments are as relevant as 90 days ago based on what we're seeing in the threat data. If you can do this type of stuff, great. Most organizations, and when I say most, I mean the overwhelming majority of organizations, don't have the time, the expertise, or the resources to do this type of work. And I would encourage you to leverage things like HITRUST. But it's really, really critical that you're consuming or understanding the context of what's happening out there by malicious actors in focusing your attention on what's important in your existing process. So just wanted to foot stomp that, wanted to kind of repeat myself in some cases. I feel that strongly about it.
Love it.
All right. So we did have a few questions come in. One of the questions is, some vendors hesitate to disclose full SBOMs due to IP concerns. How do you overcome this? I have some thoughts, but Brianna, I don't know if you...
You go ahead first. I'll jump in after.
Okay. So SBOMs are pretty specific things. The software bill of materials, it's about how, the software is built, what's included, so on and so forth. This actually, in my mind, it goes up a level higher, that you have vendors that don't want to share a full HITRUST report because there's sensitive information in that HITRUST report that they don't want to lose control over. They don't want to give away the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. So it is a legitimate challenge, a legitimate concern on both sides, right? Because if you are the TPRM person, you want that information because you want to understand what's happening behind the scenes from a security perspective. If you're the vendor, you don't want to give away the keys of the kingdom. What I've been telling folks is there's a happy medium somewhere. In the conversations that I've had with some TPRM leaders, there's just some things they're really concerned about. Think about like corrective action plans. I don't necessarily need to see all the results of your testing because I trust the auditor that did ISO, or I trust the report that was written by HITRUST. But there were gaps identified. What is your plan to close those gaps, right? So maybe that's the balance, but it's going to be unique for each organization. But I really, and this is really touchy feely, it's squishy what I'm about to say, is building relationships, partnerships with your vendors becomes critical, because if they trust you, then they may be more open minded with sharing sensitive information with you. Another tactic is to just put it in the contract. They're contractually obligated to share this information with you. I've seen a lot of people do it that way. Brianna, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head there. And I do often hear that those mumblings from my clients, they sometimes feel frustrated because they're like, I feel like I can't really complete all of the due diligence I want to until I've already onboarded my vendor due to, they don't want to share all of that information before, we actually have a relationship. There's a contract in place. So I guess the task is really just how do we get to a point where we feel confident in our decision of engaging with this vendor based on the information we have, and then how can we create a space, just as Ryan said, where we can get the information we need to make an informed decision, whether that's signing an NDA, working it into the contract. You have to show us this or we won't engage with you, things like that. It's really it's really difficult. Definitely understand the concerns on both sides, but it's one we see often. But yeah, I think you crushed it, Ryan, with your response there.
Awesome. So one more or another question that came in: how do you measure the effectiveness of a TPRM program beyond the number of assessments completed? This time I'm going to ask you to go first.
Yeah, absolutely. This kind of ties us back to the second bullet point up here on our slide. So this could really be unique to your organization. Some people might have different measures of success, and definitely number of assessments completed isn't the most valuable one. It's great to see the consistency that it's being reperformed and you're doing that. But what really matters is that you are performing the thorough assessments, that they are taking into account all potential risks that are related to your organization, that are related to the third party that you are considering, and the ones that you already engage with as well. You are monitoring them on an ongoing basis, and you have this proactive approach to that process as well. So I'm not just doing an initial review of the vendor, onboarding them and saying, great, accept all the risk, and I'll review you again in a year. You're thinking through, what do I need to change about my practices now that I've introduced this third party? What controls do I need to implement? What do I need to do on my end to mitigate this new risk that I now have, in order to create the most secure environment that I can with the new way of operating? And I think just the level of detail and the information that you rely on for these risk assessments and the due diligence you perform is truly the appropriate measure of success. And that's difficult to quantify. It's not as easy as number of assessments, but I think that really shows the true quality of a VRM program. The reliability of the information you use, the reperformance, the ongoing monitoring. If it can be continuous, that's fantastic. And then just your readiness to respond to any incidents or breaches alongside your third party, and your ability to safely and adequately offboard them if you need to. Whether something happens, it's no longer a good relationship to have, but you have to be able to do that as part of the program and still maintain the integrity of your data and your systems.
Yeah, I would offer that all of those things, just a slightly different view on it as a potential other option is, you can look at it from two different perspectives. Purely like a security professional perspective around risk management and risk mitigation, right? So we identified X number of risk. We worked with our vendors to close X percentage of that risk. That to me is quantifiable and it also meets the ultimate objective of TPRM, or vendor risk management, is managing and mitigating risk, right? But where you go from like good to great is where you can tie your actions and the outcomes to the overall business objectives, not the security facility or the security function within your business, but the overarching business. Because that's when you can then get executives on your teams to pay attention, maybe provide more resources, right? Because you're speaking in the same language of things that they understand and that are important to them. So I offer that as some, I guess, color commentary or additions to what Brianna already mentioned, because we struggle with speaking in the same terms as our business compatriots, and that's where we fall down sometimes. So, all right, a couple more questions came in. I'm new to vendor management. Our current process is to complete a risk assessment without even reaching out to the vendor, assign the tier, and either send a questionnaire or perform an audit based on the risk tier assignment. This isn't the greatest process. Would it make more sense to send a questionnaire to the vendor, conduct a risk assessment based on their responses and certificates or lack thereof, assign the risk tier, and then next steps if an audit is required? So that's a great question. I will tell you that I'd be really interested to learn how you're doing a risk assessment without talking to the vendor. So I think your mindset is on the right track. Like there's something missing there. What I've seen organizations do is there's some kind of initial risk triage, right? So think about a series of 10 questions or less to identify the inherent risk of the vendor, right? All the things that Brianna and I have already talked about. What kind of data mine are they consuming, processing, transmitting, storing? What type of privileged access or any access do they have in my environment? What happens if this vendor disappears, goes away, is unavailable? Like questions like that you can score that will tell you, hey, this is a really critical vendor to us. We need to do something about this. I'm going to say, don't get solely focused on questionnaires beyond the relationship type of questions. You can do due diligence on your own if you want to audit, test, validate what they've said or what is important to you. Obviously, I'm going to say you should rely on, recognized standards and frameworks that make your life easier and that are robust enough that it provides a level of assurance and a trust for you. But the current process to me doesn't sound like it's going to be super effective, and it's probably just more of a check the box exercise than a meaningful workflow. Bree, anything to add?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I would challenge how effective a risk assessment can be without having a baseline level of information there. And so, you definitely want some more robust information in order to effectively assign a level of risk. But to Ryan's point, you can, give like a preliminary triage based on, a short list of questions or things that you can identify doing your own research from market research, the internet, things like that, company website. And that can definitely help, build this process out a little bit more so that a more effective risk assessment can be performed for better decision making there.
Okay, I see another question that popped in. How are you evaluating AI ML vendors differently from traditional SaaS providers? How do you feel, Brianna? You want to?
Yeah, my answer is pretty straightforward. I would love to see that they've got a HITRUST security assessment. That would be my first question. Obviously, risk management, HITRUST risk management assessment is cool too, but the gold standard is a certification there. But I definitely want to see that some consideration is given for AI specific controls. My preference, obviously, I'm biased with HITRUST, of course, but Like you said, Ryan, a high trust security assessment really takes it a level deeper than NIST and ISO, which focuses mainly more on the management in the context of the organization, the management of AI and machine learning, whereas high trust complements that and goes deeper into security aspects and things like that, and you tailor them to your use of it. So if I were on a TPRM team and I was ready to engage with an AI or a machine learning vendor, my first question would be, do you have a high trust AI security assessment? Do you have a roadmap to get one? That would be something that I would hold very highly in regard in order to engage with them.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is kind of something I've already said in this presentation is you shouldn't treat them differently at all, right? They should fit in the current workflows that you have. The subtle difference is what you're looking at, right? It's about the AI specific risks and the controls that should be in place to address those risks. Otherwise, from a process perspective, they should go through the process in the exact same way. They should have everything that Brianna laid out for us on that review process and, beyond, right? Into the continuous monitoring aspect. So depending on the perspective of the question, I would say you don't have to do anything differently from a process perspective, but from a risk assessment perspective, just understand what's important from a security controls perspective. I said perspective a lot on that one.
It's important, but I
Ooh.
totally agree with you there.
Okay. Unless there are any last minute questions that come in, I think that wraps us up. Bree, any final thoughts?
Nothing for me, but thank you all so much for coming. This is topics that Ryan and I are very passionate about. It's information that we're very happy to deliver you guys. So thank you for your time. And definitely reach out to us if you have any further questions. If you want to talk more about anything that we went through, we are always happy to connect with you.
Absolutely. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks, Brianna.
Thanks, Ryan. Take care, everyone.